Welcome to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program in which we take an intergenerational approach to the book of Revelation. I'm Jon Paulien, and I'm a professor of religion at Loma Linda University. And we have with me here today, we have Gustavo Assis, who is a pastor of the Anaheim Seventh-day Adventist Church, but is also a doctoral student at Boston College in Old Testament.
Yes.
And then we have Guillermo Borda, who is a pastor of the Mentone Seventh-day Adventist Church, but he's also a doctoral student in New Testament, doing his dissertation in the book of Revelation. So we're glad to have both of these with us as we open our Bibles again to Revelation chapter 20 and verse 6. I invite you to join us in that. And I've asked Gustavo if he would read Revelation 20 verse 6 for us.
Yes, so he reads, "Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years."
I don't think we entirely finished on second death, as we were talking about that in the previous program. I want to just share a couple of things. The Bible really doesn't talk about second death. It just appears here in Revelation, it just comes and goes without explanation, possibly because it was a concept widely known. And one thing we realize is that the Egyptians had a very similar concept to this, and may even have been a source of expressing it the way that it is here. In Egyptian, the second death, their idea was that the body died and then the soul died. So they had a distinction between body and soul, unlike the Bible. But they saw the second death, you had the death of the body and then the death of the soul. So for them, second death is clearly extinction of consciousness, extinction of existence, and that seems to be exactly where Revelation is putting it, even if the anthropology is a little different. But then, in the Old Testament synagogues, they would read the Bible in the Hebrew, but the people wouldn't understand it. And so they would have someone translate the Hebrew into Aramaic, which was the language of Jesus and the language of Palestine in the first century. And in the Aramaic translations that are preserved for us, it uses second death at a number of places in the Old Testament. And basically, second death means to be excluded from the future resurrection. So you're not going to, this is the death from which there's no resurrection. It's the death of the soul. It's eternal separation from God. All right? So I think that's kind of where we were going with it. But it's interesting that in the ancient context are two major sources that use the term and that use it in the way that we see here in Revelation. So that's further confirmation that the second death is extinction of existence rather than something else. Yeah.
I have a question in terms of the first category, the Egyptian material. Do we have any other example from the book of Revelation of some sort of Egyptian background to the images, to the ideas, or this will be an isolated incident?
I think it's relatively isolated. I believe there's one or two other places where you run into it, but I don't have those on recall at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in
but
that
this
case,
one is clearly, this one is such a parallel that you could almost say, Revelation was building on that.
Yeah. Well, when it is a neighbor of Palestine, Egypt is a neighbor, so ideas travel and people.
Jesus grew up there.
Exactly, and so the Christianity thrived in Egypt right at the beginning, like the Book of Acts. But I think the idea is possibly the one behind John, but the Targums, I think, are also a solid source for the notion of the second death, as you were saying.
So Guillermo, just a quick thought question on this. Let's accept, for the sake of argument, that the Egyptian background is real, that this is in fact something that, they may not have known it as Egyptian, but that this idea, that the Egyptian idea is clearly formed within the Jewish minds. Why would God use a pagan concept in Scripture?
I mean, the book of Revelation, we see examples of what I like to refer to as cultural engagement. There is cultural engagement that is constructive in the book of Revelation. In the New Testament in general, for example, Paul's use of athletic metaphors in a constructive way.
So even though communicate.
Yeah, to communicate.
If you want to communicate to anybody, you got to talk their language.
Even though in those athletic contexts there was a lot of evil, but Paul would find something that can lift out of there and apply positively. It's a constructive engagement. But you also have polemical engagement, right? So it has been pointed out that, you know, there's at least a possibility that Jesus presenting himself as the one who has the keys, you know, of death and Hades, could be, in a way, a polemical attack, or, you know, or discrediting the notion of the goddess Hecate, who was believed to have the keys. No, it's not Hecate. It is Jesus Christ that has the keys, right? So it's a matter of God communicating. So it could be in a constructive manner to use something that people understand. Jesus did that in his ministry. You know, we can find it clearly. But also, it is also a matter of getting things, let's get things straight. Let's make things clear. And this engagement helps with that clarification too.
Yeah, and so, I think this is an important point for me to underline to our listeners. That's, you know, sometimes we have the idea, well, the Bible is so holy, it wouldn't do anything like that. That's kind of a Greek idea. That's why the Greeks didn't do scientific research. Even though they were scientific thinkers, they didn't do scientific research because they thought matter was evil, you see. So God sometimes uses these ideas to communicate. And you have to talk the language if it's going to make sense.
Yeah.
But now, Guillermo, when you read the verse, I noticed something else. It says that these people will be priests of God for 1,000 years. Why do you need priests? What did priests do in the Old Testament? Why do you need them after the second coming of Jesus? Well, will there be sacrifices up there?
It will be a very different type of priesthood than the priesthood that you had in the Old Testament, right? For one, these priests never die. As the book of Hebrews makes very clear, you know, the priesthood in the Old Testament was remarkably limited by death. Whereas Jesus, the high priest that died once for all and he lives forever, he doesn't have to be replaced, right? So these priests won't die. It's different. This is in a moment now, these are redeemed. You know, there's no need for sacrifice. The one sacrifice once for all for Jesus has already been made. So it will be different. But, you know, this also ties back to the beautiful worship scene in chapter 5, you know, where they say, you have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth. Of course, here, you know, he's talking about reigning during the millennium. Later, they will reign on the earth, the new earth. But I don't know exactly what it means to be a priest in that context. Especially later, you will see, you know, you'll see no temple, you know. But whatever it means, it is something that is, in a very meaningful way, different. They will be people that are in communion with God. They interact. They are in relationship with God directly. You know, so it will be different.
I agree 100%. There is a different type of priesthood that is envisioned, and it reminds me of, I think it is a chapter of the book of your friend Greg Beale, The Church and the Temple, or The Temple and the Church, in which he makes the argument that the Garden of Eden was like a temple. So you have several elements of the garden as the temple of God, and Adam and Eve were the first priests. And so part of the job of this first priest, remember, before sin, is to safeguard, to guard, and I forgot the other verb, to toil and to guard the garden. And so the idea of guarding, protecting, Adam failed miserably, and Eve, because third chapter of Genesis, you have the serpent. And it is intriguing that in this chapter 20, you have the introduction of these redeemed individuals who are vindicated. Iris' point in the previous episode. They are now, the second death has no power over them. and they are acting as priests in the sense, I think, of protecting, guarding, because in verse 7, you have Satan out of the prison deceiving the nations. So they are, for lack of a better term, vaccinated with this idea that they have to protect this confederation of the people of God again. And so I don't know if that makes sense, bringing Bill's perspective.
So you bring up an interesting point that the priests were the guardians of the temple.
Yeah.
So they were kind of like, you know, when you think of Vatican City, you've got the Swiss guards and stuff like that. So kind of a special holy soldiers, you could say. But I was listening to a scholar of Leviticus the other day, and he pointed out, he says, there's no theology in Leviticus. You just have sacrifices and things listed and rules and regulations, but nowhere does it explain, why do you sacrifice? You know, it'll tell you how, but it won't tell you why. It won't explain the meaning of it and so on. And his response was, that was the job of the priests. It was their job to teach the people, to explain to them, okay, the reason you're bringing this sacrifice, it means this and so. And so that engagement was important. In eternity, I think priests will be needed because God respects freedom. And even in eternity, it is possible for a person to doubt. It's possible for a person to raise questions, etc. And that's one reason to put human beings in charge, because those who have been through sin, those who have recovered from this terrible mess, will be the very people who can say, hey, you don't want to go there. Let me tell you why. You know? So there'll be that ministry of reconciliation, that ministry of keeping people free, yet loyal to God.
That's a good perspective. And in fact, I was thinking of the word Torah, law, that we translate as law, but it's actually instruction. Instruction. And it comes from the verb to teach, to instruct, yara. So the job of the priest was exactly that, to instruct, to teach people. And in that sense, it makes sense to have priests.
And the Jews have always thought that the Torah had an oral equivalent. That Moses wrote the Torah, but he shared with Joshua and others, you know, the deeper meaning, and that was supposed to be passed on through the priesthood.
Would it be appropriate to say, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, the fact that we see here that they're priests of God and of Christ and will reign with Him for 1,000 years, would it be correct to say that their priestly function during these 1,000 years includes precisely the task of judgment? Would it be correct to say that judgment is also one of the priestly functions? You know, I mean, it seems to me that that would fit. I mean, is it correct to say that you know, judging is also one of the priestly functions? So that would be at least one of the ways in which they function as priests during the millennium.
Well, it reminds me of Exodus 28, the breastplate of judgment. So it is part of the responsibility of the high priest and priests to perform mishpat, judgment. So that brings back to the notion of judgment that we have in verse 4 onwards.
So the priests and the kings are both judges as well.
So
you have
they are priestly rulers, right?
Priestly rulers.
Both priests and they reign.
And this is a mirror of Christ, who is a high priest and who is also a king. So he's
and Moses was never called a king. But he was the priestly family, and he also ruled Israel at the same time.
Exactly.
So, all right, 1,000 years. One thing in Revelation 20 doesn't explain is where are the 1,000 years? Are the 1,000 years in heaven? You know, when Jesus comes, does he take his people to heaven? Or is the 1,000 years on earth? And many godly Christians believe that when Jesus comes the second time, he doesn't come to take people to heaven, he comes to be with his people on earth. And he rules on this earth, the millennial reign. Okay, so the big question is, if Revelation 20 doesn't explain that, do we have any idea? You know, I know that Seventh-day Adventists think that that is in heaven, but where in Revelation 20 does it tell us that?
I think there's evidence when you read Revelation 20 and 21 together, and considering also the background, the Jewish background of how a wedding happened. So in a wedding, when the groom comes, he doesn't come to be with the wife where she is. He comes to take her, that she can come and be where he is. Jesus went to prepare a place for us that we might be where he is. And then the question is, someone say, well, but what if he brings where he is down here? Yes, but in Revelation, that only happens later. So, you know, with that understanding, I think, you know, and there's more, you know, that we could say, but just that in itself, I think, is already, you know, raises a significantly, moderately strong case that, you know, hey, I don't think this is here. Plus, when you consider, you know, that they will be in a place of reward, right? But then, what is happening on earth, right? So if you read verse 7, when there's Satan there, is released, right? So he was in prison where? So it seems to be then that earth will be this prison, and that the people of God will be in Jerusalem, which will then only after the millennium come down, right? So it seems to make more sense of the text. And also when you get the notion of marriage, which, by the way, is used in the book of Revelation, when you take those things together, it seems to make much more sense of the text and this background. They understand that they go up. But also, it's not only there, it's also in the rest of the New Testament. This notion that when Jesus comes, they will go up. As in 1 Thessalonians 4, for example, the people are resurrected, you know, and it's not just, there's those that will be alive, those that will be resurrected. One group doesn't go ahead of the other. We all go up together. Go up to where? Where clearly we're not staying here when Jesus comes.
Well, catch this. This is the context of Revelation 20. In chapter 19, verse 1, after this I heard what seemed to be the loud voice of a great multitude in heaven. Now the great multitude in chapter 7 was who? It was those who had been redeemed from the earth. Right? So it's the voice of a great multitude, hallelujah, you know, salvation, glory, power belong to our God, etc. So that is the preceding context that chapter 20 puts God's people in heaven. A parallel to that is Revelation 7. And chapter 7, verses 15 and beyond. It says of the great multitude, they are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. He who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. No longer hunger anymore or thirst anymore. The sun will not strike them, for the Lamb is in the midst of the throne as their shepherd. God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So there's so many allusions to the redeemed being in heaven, and you have that in chapter 21. When the New Jerusalem comes down, God wipes away the tears from their eyes. So it's tying all these things together. So I would say within Revelation 20 itself, you've got to lean in the direction that the abyss is a desolate earth and the redeemed are in heaven for that 1,000 years. But there is a slam dunk, and I think Guilherme hinted at it, and we'll see that in elsewhere. In John chapter 14 and verse 1, where Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. What is the Father's house? It's the New Jerusalem. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Now, Jesus could easily have said here, I go to prepare a place for you, and I will come again so that where you are, I may be also. The exact opposite. You see, it's very, very clear. When he comes, it's to take his people to his Father's house, to the New Jerusalem, which after the millennium comes down from heaven. Yeah. So I think a whole scripture view kind of settles things. And your marriage analogy.
If we were to stay here
correct,
during, when Jesus comes, and then New Jerusalem comes down, then we would never go up.
Yeah.
So to make sense of, the notion that at some point we'll go up, like 1 Thessalonians 4, well, when is that time that goes up? It has to be during the millennium. Because if New Jerusalem comes down and we don't go up in the beginning of the millennium, then we would never go up. So it doesn't make sense. So we must go up in the beginning of the millennium and then come back down at the end of the millennium.
Got to go up. It sounds almost like one of those spirituals.
Yeah.
Got to go up, brother.
I have one question here about this exact verse, John 14, verse 2, the many rooms. I remember, if the memory serves me well, that the language here is of a temporary lodging. The Greek here is not envisioning something permanent, but temporary. Condominium
rather than a private home with a
yard. Exactly. So do you think this is correct in the sense that this place where the Father is taking us, or Jesus is taking us, that he is preparing, he went to prepare, this is temporary, this is not definitive. And then in Revelation 21, you actually see that coming down and being permanent, being, let's say,
it's kind of disappointing, I think, if you have the idea of this New Jerusalem coming down and then for eternity we're cooped up in a city when you got this whole planet to explore. I think the idea that the New Jerusalem is kind of like a giant hotel, and that once the redeemed get out there, they'll be assigned different properties and stuff. Maybe they get to choose, here's A, B, C, D. Which part of the world would you like to live? What kind of a setting, mountains, ocean, et cetera. So you pick out your property, and then you begin planning, and you got 1,000 years to work on this. So you take your time building a nice house, country home.
When you say 1,000 years, just to make clear to our viewers, we're not talking about the 1,000 years of Revelation 20. Well, right, in that regard, in the New Earth, you're just mentioning that time is not an issue.
You got plenty. Hey, if you want to plan that house all through the millennium, you can do that. So, but again, if the New Jerusalem in heaven may also have its own properties, who knows? We got a lot to learn about that. But it's clear, I think, that the 1,000 years takes place in heaven for the redeemed, and comes back down to earth then. So let's go on to verses 7 and 8. Guillermo, if you would, read those for us.
Sure. Revelation 27 and 8 in SB 95 says, when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The number of them is like the sand of the seashore.
All right, so now we get to the end of the 1,000 years, as verse 5a makes clear that the rest of the dead won't come out. So the question is, if the nations were destroyed at the second coming, and Revelation 19:15 tells us that, who are these nations?
Right, verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. So they are brought back to life. It is a resurrection for judgment, but they are brought back to life. And so here now Satan again has humans as targets of his deception.
So these are the same nations as before. It's just they're resurrected nations, be going around, yeah, I'm an Assyrian, I'm a Babylonian, yeah, I'm a Brazilian, what's that, Everybody.
No Brazilians will be there.
No Brazilians will be there, okay, that's good. So, but how can he deceive them again?
Well,
when they've already, the deception's already been exposed. Remember in chapter 17, 16, the beast and the horns are furious with Babylon when they realize they've been deceived.
Yeah. But then we got to remember, right, over there they attack Babylon, but does not mean they're out of deception, more generally construed. They attack Babylon, the beast and the horns, you know, there's the lament, chapter 17, all of that, chapter 18, all of that, but they're still under Satan's deception, because Satan's deception is, there's this, you know, a climax in chapter 17 with deception around Babylon, but his deception is not limited to Babylon alone. And so they're still under the influence of Satan. And plus, since this is after the close of probation, chapter 15, verse 8, they're completely given over, handed over to evil. And so they are, you know, manipulable, deceivable, you know, Satan's deceptions are beyond Babylon.
You know, I'm not a psychologist, but all this reminds me of several stories of abusive, let's say, husbands, that it is surprising that after suffering in the hands of someone abusive, you would think that some people, the victims, will want to stay away, but there's this awkward thing going on in their brains that they still go after the abusive husband. So I think it is a little similar dynamic that we are seeing here. All these nations that are experiencing the resurrection of judgment because of Satan are still they are accepting his lies and believing in his lies and still being attracted to.
So it's a new context.
Yeah.
All right. Like you said, it's not Babylon and Assyria and Brazil anymore. This is a totally new context, and they're coming at it fresh. But they were raised with the same minds, with the same emotions, with the same weaknesses, etc. Even perhaps with the same injuries. You know. So it's not a pure resurrection the way the righteous have it. So they are raised with the same minds, and as you said, they're easily deceived. There's something about sin that makes you believe the lie and reject the truth.
Yeah.
You know, your thinking is distorted. It says that in Ezekiel 28 about Satan. Lucifer's thinking became distorted the moment he rebelled against God. It's something that happened inside of himself. So we see at the end of the millennium, the unsaved are all raised together. Everybody on earth throughout history is all together in one place at the same time. And that's when we get a couple of words, Gog and Magog. We're going to get into that next time. Iris has been doing some amazing research with artificial intelligence, and she's going to be with us next time to share that. You're not going to want to miss it. This has been GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises.